Hi there, this is the second part of the 6.03 lesson. Let's continue on with where we were reading. Let's read this excerpt here for Sunni and Shiite. Early in the history of Islam, not long after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, a disagreement over who should rule split the followers of Islam into two groups, the Sunnis and the Shias, who are often referred to as the Shiites. The split has caused bitter struggles within Islam. The division persists to this day. Currently, there are far more Sunni than Shiite Muslims. Sunnis make up roughly 85% of the world's Muslim population. Trouble in Lebanon. During and beyond the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the Middle East remained a troubled region. The sources of strife were many: masses of people living under repressive governments, millions living in poverty, the simmering anger of Palestinians seeking an independent homeland, resentment toward Israel and its main Western backer, the United States, the growing influence of militant Islamists, and within Islam, flaring violence between Sunni and Shiite Muslims. Many of these volatile factors came together when Lebanon collapsed into violence in the mid-1970s. Muslims battled Arab Christians. Sunni Muslims battled Shiites. In 1982, Israel sent troops to the capital city of Beirut to root out strongholds of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, whose members had conducted guerrilla attacks against Israel. Partly in response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, radical Shiite Muslims in Lebanon formed a group called Hezbollah, a name that means Party of God. Many of the group's leaders were young, militant clerics who had been educated and trained in Iran, where they embraced the ideas of Ayatollah Khomeini. They envisioned a revolutionary Shiite Muslim state in Lebanon, much like the government that controlled Iran under Khomeini. Israel, they said, was an infidel power and therefore an enemy of Islam. Hezbollah radicals also regarded the United States as an infidel nation because of its support of Israel. Hezbollah recruited young volunteers to engage in a new form of terror, almost one impossible to stop: suicide bombers. Suicide bombers strap explosives to their bodies or load their vehicles with bombs, then get as close as they can to their target, whether a crowded marketplace or military base. The Quran condemns taking one's own life, but they are willing to kill themselves and innocent bystanders in order to generate terror. In August 1982, Reagan committed 2,000 Marines to a multinational peacekeeping force in Lebanon. In April 1983, a member of Hezbollah rammed a van loaded with explosives into the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. 63 people died in the explosion. In October 1983, Hezbollah attacked American and French troops stationed in Lebanon as part of an international peacekeeping force. A suicide bomber drove a large truck through a gate at a U.S. Marine compound in Beirut. He plowed into the lobby of the headquarters, setting off the equivalent of more than 12,000 pounds of TNT and killing 241 U.S. service members. At the same time, another suicide bomber attacked barracks housing French troops, killing 58 soldiers. Reagan decided not to retaliate. In early 1984, he pulled the remaining Marines out of Lebanon. In part, he was responding to growing pressure from the American public. In part, the lessons of Vietnam made him avoid further involvement in a conflict driven by so many complex rivalries. And here's a picture of the explosion in Beirut here at the top left. A new military strategy, Star Wars. And we're not talking about the, Star Wars movie. Well, okay, anyway. When Reagan took office in 1981, he worried that the United States was vulnerable because the Soviets had more land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Although his opponents pointed out that the Soviet advantage in land-based ICBMs was offset by American superiority in nuclear arms on submarines and bombers, Reagan pushed for a buildup of both nuclear and conventional weapons. Reagan reasoned that with more weapons and a stronger military, the United States could bargain with the Soviets from a position of strength. To many observers, it seemed like Reagan was escalating the arms race. Some state legislatures passed resolutions calling for a freeze on the development and testing of nuclear weapons. Even as he aimed to build America's nuclear strength, Reagan did not accept the principle of mutually assured destruction, MAD, the idea the United States and the Soviet Union would refrain from using nuclear weapons because to do so would mean certain annihilation for both. Reagan dismissed MAD as a policy that left both nations vulnerable to dishonesty and accidents. He compared it to two Westerners standing in a saloon, aiming their guns at each other's head, permanently. In March 1983, Reagan announced an ambitious research program to implement his Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Using powerful lasers and particle beams mounted on orbiting satellites, the system would detect and shoot down incoming missiles. Reagan asserted that SDI would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And here's a picture of, as it says, during research for Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, a high-energy laser explodes a Titan I missile. Okay, Reagan asserted that SDI would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. He offered to share SDI technology once it was developed with other countries, including the Soviet Union, so that all nations could be safe from nuclear attack. Skeptics, including many scientists, called the program Star Wars. They said the whole idea was like the popular movie, pure science fiction fantasy. In 1985, Congress granted $3 billion for research and development on SDI. Soviet leaders fumed. Compared to the United States, the USSR was already devoting a far greater percentage of its gross domestic product to military expenditures. Now with the announcement of SDI, Reagan was pressuring the Soviets into yet more military spending just to keep up, further burdening their already faltering economy. In the end, Star Wars system was never developed, though the research did lead to some new anti-missile technologies. The beginning of the end of the Cold War. In Reagan's second term as president, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union changed in dramatic and surprising ways. This was in part due to new Soviet leadership. In 1985, a new and younger leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took the helm in the Soviet Union. He was the opposite of the aging, business-as-usual men who had led the Soviet Union since the death of Khrushchev. Gorbachev, unlike Brezhnev, his predecessor, acknowledged that the Soviet economy was in shambles. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was efficient in only in producing weapons. Worse, the ongoing war in Afghanistan continued to drain resources. Gorbachev realized that his country must either reform or collapse. And here's a picture of Gorby, as he was commonly called in the press, Gorby. Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet reformer and perestroika advocate, is greeted by well-wishers. And as you can see, he has this large birthmark on his head, which is commonly reflected in political cartoons of the time of Gorbachev. And let's read a little bit about this inside of the 1984 election. In 1984, an improving economy boosted Reagan's popularity. His re-election campaign highlighted the renewed prosperity with TV ads declaring, "It's morning in America." The Democrats nominated Walter Mondale, Carter's former vice president, to oppose Reagan. Mondale chose as running mate New York Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman on the presidential ticket of a major party. By the way, Mondale was from Minnesota. Mondale attacked Reagan's deficits and the growing gap between rich and poor, but the Democrats could not make a case to unseat the great communicator. Reagan won everywhere except Minnesota, Mondale's home state, and the District of Columbia. A Soviet reformer. Gorbachev proposed bold new reforms. He pressed for perestroika, or restructuring of the Soviet economy. To encourage entrepreneurship and investment, he proposed to allow local factory workers, rather than the Communist Party, to make production decisions. He also called for glasnost, a Russian term that means openness, candor, and transparency. In Gorbachev's view, Soviet citizens should be allowed to speak more openly about their society's problems. He believed that government should stop trying to control ideas and speech. He called for an end to such practices as banning books, jamming foreign radio broadcasts, and throwing dissidents into prison. Gorbachev was not trying to overthrow socialism. He wanted to streamline the system. With dissidents growing, Gorbachev realized that the Kremlin could not maintain its totalitarian grip over such a broad, unwilling population. Gorbachev knew that he could not heal the Soviet economy without slashing military spending. Eager to slow the arms race that was bankrupting his country, he became the first Soviet General Secretary to meet with Reagan face-to-face. Their first summit in Geneva, Switzerland in 1985 ended without any formal agreement, but the two spent hours in conversation and developed a rapport. Reagan noted a warmth in his face and style, not the coldness bordering on hatred I've seen in most other senior Soviet leaders I'd met until then. In 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev held a second summit, this time in Reykjavik, Iceland. Desperate to cut his nation's military spending, Gorbachev offered to make major weapon cutbacks if the United States would do the same. Reagan responded with a breathtaking proposal that both sides eliminate all nuclear weapons in 10 years. It was a possibility hardly to be dreamed of, perhaps a chance to end the arms race. Gorbachev agreed on one condition: Reagan must give up his Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan refused. He was determined to make sure the United States could defend itself against a missile attack, and besides, he knew the USSR was in a race it could not afford. The two leaders left Reykjavik without an agreement, but with hope. Reykjavik is not a failure, Gorbachev said. It is a breakthrough for which the first time enabled us to look over the horizon. Tear down this wall. Reagan believed that Gorbachev sincerely wanted to reform the Soviet Union, but the American president also realized that despite glasnost and perestroika, the Soviet Union continued to deny basic human rights to millions. In June 1987, Reagan decided to issue a public challenge to his Soviet counterpart. He traveled to West Berlin, a city surrounded by the communist dictatorship of East Germany. Standing near the hated Berlin Wall, the president gave a rousing speech. General Secretary Gorbachev, said Reagan, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I have a great video that I'll show in Class Connect of that speech. And it's just so moving to hear him say that, the call to tear down this wall. It's really fantastic. Anyway, Reagan's speech was broadcast across Europe. He knew his words would reach millions of oppressed residents in the Soviet bloc. To those longing for freedom, his message was clear. The United States was on their side. Gorbachev did not tear down the Berlin Wall, but he did continue on the path of reform, and he kept talking with Reagan. In late 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed an all-important treaty. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF Treaty, eliminated ground-launched missiles with ranges of 300 to 3,400 miles. For the first time during the arms race, Americans and Soviets agreed to the destruction of nuclear weapons, even if only a specific kind. And here's a picture of Reagan and Gorbachev signing that treaty. And here's the rest of the transcript of Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I'll read it. Why not? 24 years ago, President John F. Kennedy visited Berlin, speaking to the people of the city and the world at City Hall. Well, since then, two other presidents have come, each in his turn, to Berlin. And today, I myself make my second visit to your city. We come to Berlin, we American presidents, because it's our duty to speak in this place of freedom. Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of a city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. Standing before the Brandenburg Gate, every man is a German, separated from his fellow men. Every man is a Berliner, forced to look upon a scar being the wall. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state? Or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable. That would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The end of that speech. Okay, that was the stopping for the reading today. Then we go back. Make sure you check your reading guide with the lesson answer key to make sure you got the correct information on your reading guide. And then we have to continue with the Cold War Warriors Part 1. And we will start this actually in another video because we've almost reached our 15-minute maximum for this one. And we'll start up with this last part of the 603 lesson and the Part 3 video.